disease, and they're annoying and all that sort of thing. And he figures if you don't like, Hollywood figures if you don't like small bugs, you really won't like big bugs. So here's some big bugs. Of course, any of you who know the scaling laws know that if you were to take a real bug and scale them up like this, not only would it be unappetizing, but he would collapse under his own weight immediately. But still, Hollywood doesn't work that way. So these are some bad aliens. Most of them are anthropomorphic, right? This is from a 1950s film, This Island Earth, I believe. And here you can see this guy looks pretty much like the people, the Earthlings standing behind him, right? I mean, he doesn't have quite as much hair, and he wears his brain on the outside, which is probably a bad idea, but he looks pretty much like us. He's just doing some sit-ups there. And in fact, these are some aliens from Star Trek. This is the lazy god aliens, they're called, because it's as if God only really could think of one design for intelligent creatures. Right? I mean, these guys, could all be fixed by a good plastic surgeon. They look so much like us. And I think that implicitly we kind of assume something like this. Here's your standard alien. Again, this guy looks very much like us, right? And Laurie Marino, who's a biologist at Emory University, has pointed out to me many times that this is simply a projection of what we think our future is likely to be when we've lost all our hair and just have big eyes because we sit around designing websites. But, so what? Again, so what? Does it matter? Is this just all sort of idle speculation and maybe of some benefit to Hollywood to figure out what they might look like? And I think it does matter, and here's the example of why I say that. Here you see Percy Lowell back at the beginning of the 20th century in his observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, modestly named the Lowell Observatory. And he was studying Mars. In fact, that was the principal reason he built the observatory, was to study Mars. It's not all that Lowell did. He did some very good work. He was a very bright guy. I think you all know that. In fact, it's often been said he's the smartest guy ever to go to Harvard. Somebody's laughing. I don't know why you're laughing at that, but you can tell me later. I'm sure there's an in-joke there. In fact, one of his brother was, in fact, the president of Harvard for a long time. But in any case, and as you can see, in 1900 you would put on a suit and a tie to sit alone in a dark dome all night. Lowell was following up on the work of an Italian astronomer, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who in 1877 first published about the so-called canals on Mars. It's very interesting if you read what Schiaparelli wrote about the canals on Mars, because in his more widely distributed publications on this, he was very careful to say, look, it looks like the polar caps melt in the Martian summer, and then you get this darkening around the polar caps, which is obviously the meltwater, and then these channels open up. But they come, they go, and probably they're just natural channels. I mean, canali and channels are the same word, but so are canali and canals. In some of the things he wrote in Italy, he was, just for Italian audiences, he was much less conservative, and he not only sort of speculated on the engineering capabilities of the Martians who were doing all this trench work, but he also talked a lot about their political systems. They were obviously socialists and so forth, because they had to, all work together to build these canals and whatever, that kind of thing. So, he had it both ways. But Lowell thought that he saw the canals, and as you know, Lowell was an extraordinarily good, he was not only a good mind, but he was a very good popularizer too. I don't think many people today know that, but he gave excellent talks. He wrote several books. He was a good writer. His book Mars, it's just very well written, and the public believed all this, and he did till his death. Now, so my point is, does it matter what ET looks like? And my answer is yes, and this is the reason. Here's some pictures of Mars. This is how we were looking for Martians 100 years ago. You went to a telescope in Flagstaff, Arizona with an 8-inch lens, and you simply looked at the planet. So there's some of Lowell's handiwork. He had all the canals numbered and named. This is I think this photo appeared in the Flammarion, one of Flammarion's books about astronomy. Kind of looks like Holland without the gabled architecture, perhaps, and the cows. There is, well, as I say, this was believed, it was assumed that there was a giant hydraulic civilization just 30 million miles away. This is from 1908. This is a pictorial representation of the Martians. Apparently this is a party on Mars. I don't know. You can see that, again, they look like us, right? I mean, fairly much. If a couple like that in the foreground, you can tell they're a couple because the females wear the headgear, have bigger eyelashes. If they moved in next door, eventually you'd get around to inviting them over for dinner. I mean, you might talk behind their back, but, they don't look that different, really, okay? Well, this is not so long ago. This is 100 years ago, okay? By the 1930s, we knew that Mars had a very, very thin atmosphere. But of course, everybody also recognized that Mars's gravity was less, so presumably the Martians were taller, less gravity, and had bigger lungs because of the thinner atmosphere. So this is what the Martians looked like in the early 1930s, but they're still pretty much just like us, and they even shake hands. Now, as you know, in the 1970s, the mid-1970s, NASA's Viking landers plopped down onto the Martian surface and sent back these photos. You've seen lots of these photos. But of course, in 1976, 1977, it was a fantastic thing when these shutters opened up and for the first time showed us Mars. Because after all, they could have shown us this, right? And they did, you know, nobody knew, and they did. In fact, one Caltech professor at the time said the only thing that was required to discover life on Mars was a camera. Right? You just put a camera down on the surface of Mars and you'd see the life. Well, there you go. Now, mind you, this is not to disprove this thesis. Another guy at Caltech, Norm Horowitz, who was in part of the Viking biology team, actually said, well, it could be that there's life on Mars that looks like rocks. On the other hand, what look like rocks in this photo might be rocks, which they are. Okay, but this was a bit of a disappointment because even the most, if you will, conservative scientists at the time thought that there was at least a good chance there'd be some sort of lichen or some other plant life on the surface of Mars, and there's not. The surface of Mars is a terrible place. It's all oxidized because of the ultraviolet light from the sun and so forth. It's just sterile. It's sterile. Okay? Well, in 1996, Martians were again in the news. This was the biggest science news story of 1996, little Rodney here. And the claim that was being made, and is still made by the authors of that paper, is that that is a fossilized Martian from 4 billion years ago, found in a Martian meteorite that was picked up in the Antarctic. And there's no doubt that the meteorite is from Mars. And as Chris McKay at NASA likes to say, we know that because there's a little brass plate on the bottom that says, made on Mars. It's being slightly disingenuous, but that's not the issue. The issue is whether this is truly a Martian. And most of the people that work in the field of astrobiology are rather less certain that this is truly Martian. In fact, they're very skeptical. So this has not been considered compelling proof that Mars has or ever had life. This is, however, some more recent data. This is one of the orbiters here, and you see a photo made of a crater wall in 1999 on the left, and then just 6 years later, in 2005, you see that streak, right? Some liquid or very viscous gas has popped out of the side of that hill and run down the wall a little bit. Okay, most likely it's water. So the thought now is that there may be life on Mars, but the way to find it is to send, Bruce Willis to Mars with a bunch of roughnecks, and just drill a couple 100 feet deep into the Martian surface and pull up whatever's down below, because there are likely to be aquifers, liquid water, beneath the surface of Mars. And if you were to drill a hole outside the hotel here, even a mile deep, even 2 miles deep, and pull up the muck at the bottom of that hole, you would find bacteria there. You would find life. Okay. So my point is that our expectation of what the Martians will be like greatly has affected the way we search for them. 100 years ago, we searched for Martians using an 8-inch refracting telescope in Arizona. Today, if we want to search for Martians, we have to send robots to Mars and, best yet, dig down deep into the surface of Mars. Right? So the idea of what they might be like, are they some sort of, intelligent beings intent on all these shovel-ready engineering projects, or are they microbes? It does matter what you're looking for, okay? Well, our picture of ET has been, to begin with, carbon-based. Usually that's the assumption made, okay? And maybe that's not a bad assumption. Here's the periodic table. Many of you haven't seen this since the 10th grade, 11th grade, whatever. But there it is. Carbon is actually sui generis. Carbon is much, much better at hooking up with other atoms, including other carbon atoms, to make very complex molecules. And it's better at that than in any of the other elements. If you look underneath carbon in the periodic table, the next thing you come to is silicon. And silicon, also has those 4 covalent bonds. It likes to hook up with other atoms, but it's not nearly as good because it's a bigger atom. So, when carbon hooks up with oxygen, you get carbon dioxide, which is filling the atmosphere of this room, and it was very, the plants appreciate that. With silicon, when it hooks up with oxygen, you get